Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. When I sat down with Mike Mason, we talked about the conversion from the sixth edition of Call of Cthulhu to the new seventh edition of Call of Cthulhu. I'm going to jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel. It helps us out and it lets us make more content like this. Thank you.
Um, it's a great question, and there's not an easy answer. Myself and Paul, when we started the work on 7th edition, the first thing we did, we got together with a copy of the 6th edition of the Call of Cthulhu rulebook, and we literally went through it page by page, noting down, how the rulebook was structured. If things were logical, where there was illogical placement in the information in terms of the flow of information. We made notes of particular rules that we thought maybe needed a look at. But it was a general kind of sense of how does the rulebook come across? Is it how, I guess, user-friendly is it to not only us as players who've been playing for like 30 plus years, how more importantly does it come across to somebody who's never opened an RPG book before? And so because we felt that the 6th edition, whilst it was absolutely fine for anyone that played Call of Cthulhu before or an experienced role player in that sense, it wasn't very user-friendly to newer players. There were information, particularly in rules, would jump around. There'd be a section on combat here, and then a few pages about something else, and then there'd be some spot rules about combat and things like that. And we just felt it could be a little bit more friendlier in terms of how it was imparting the information. The other factor that came up that was always in our minds is there are a number of rules in Call of Cthulhu in various editions that have never really been particularly well understood by the community. And I'm thinking particularly of grapple here, where for 30 years, ask a room of keepers to explain how the grapple rules work, and you would get, 10 keepers, you'd get 10 different answers. So clearly there was some clarity issues around how certain rules might be interpreted or received. And so we wanted to identify those and see where we could maybe streamline them, make them clearer, whether they were still useful, rules in that sense. So all those kind of things we were kind of noting down and having an ongoing discussion on that lasted kind of all day, kind of, back and forwards about, well, I remember when I did this, or I remember playing in a game and this happened to me, and all those kind of anecdotes on top of, what was presented in front of us in the text. So that's how we started, because obviously the other key factor in terms of the mission statement is that we couldn't create a new game. We were revising and updating an existing game, Call of Cthulhu, that needed to remain Call of Cthulhu and play like and feel like and experience like Call of Cthulhu. Because it would have been far easier to just start with a blank slate and go like, let's create a game based on the Cthulhu mythos. And then we could have not worried about anything that was a problem before. But that wasn't the job. The job was to, refresh and update the Call of Cthulhu rules without throwing the baby out with the bathwater in that sense. We wanted it to be the same game because it's our passion, our game that we love. And so we don't want to break it or change it in that sense. We just wanted to improve and make it more user-friendly, I guess.
You said that Call of Cthulhu is the passion, it's the thing that you love. When you opened up the rule book that time, what were some of the things that stood out to you that immediately fit well, that you were happy they were there, that you carried across without much concern?
I mean, the core of the game is obviously basic roleplay, BRP, the Chaosium system. And so that, that's the heart of the system, making percentile rolls and having skills as percentiles. Because for many years, what I've observed, because I've run many games with people that have never role played before and introduced them to the game through Call of Cthulhu, through Call of Cthulhu. And one thing I've noticed time and time again, with people that aren't familiar with role playing, is that they get percentages straight away. I don't need to explain them. When I say your climb skill is 30%, or 80%, they immediately know that one of them is pretty good and one of them is pretty bad. It's not like me saying you've got climb 2 or 7, which is that good or bad? I don't know. But when you say it's a percentage, it's pretty clear. It's very intuitive because we understand percentages most of the time. So that's the heart of the system, and obviously we wouldn't want to change that anyway. So we wanted to just kind of build on top of that. But that's the heart of it. Obviously, things like the sanity mechanic is what Call of Cthulhu is all about. It's what made it stand out, innovative from any role-playing game when it was launched, and so the heart of that was fine in terms of some kind of mechanic to be able to determine a character's position when exposed to the horrors and mind-bending effects of the Cthulhu mythos. Obviously, then we get into areas where things get more complicated, because whilst the heart of that was fine, some of the interpretation of that rule in terms of the earlier editions and on the table can be problematic, in terms of the depiction of mental health and things like that, which we didn't feel was really what the heart of the rule was about. What the heart of the rule is about the corruption of humanity by the mythos. And it comes through in terms of a person's kind of mental awareness and capacity, in terms of how the mythos is insidious and not only can eat you and eat your hit points, it can eat effectively your mental outlook in that sense. So we wanted to kind of move away, because there have been books published in the past some years ago where it went very, written by mental health practitioners for Call of Cthulhu, where it's very much a models modern mental health theory and medicine. We wanted to move away from that because I didn't think that was appropriate in really. It's not really what the game is meant to be about. And so we wanted to move it to a more cinematic and back to its root in terms of Lovecraft, in terms of it being what happens when you're exposed to the Cthulhu mythos, not you develop a real world mental health condition. That's not really what it's about. And so we wanted to move that away. And also, the rules have never explained what happens when you go when a character loses all their sanity points and goes insane, in that sense, in game terms. It's quite woolly, other than temporarily, and indefinite and then permanent. There's no real guidance on what that means on the gaming table. So we felt that was an area that needed to be developed, especially on the lines of that I was talking about, in terms of a cinematic, more kind of open kind of system, that we wanted to ensure that players and keepers knew what this meant, and so it didn't. And so this is a long way of saying what we were trying to get away from was occasionally a player will just their character will fall insane through exposure, and they kind of take it as a license to be silly at the table. I'm being quite broad in my terms here. Silly, which can be a kind of a bit of a death knell to the game and the atmosphere, because I've suddenly decided I'm going to have to kill all the other player characters because that will be fun. And yes, potentially, if that's what your group wants, but I've seen it happen many times at convention games and elsewhere, where it just kind of destroys the game. And so we wanted to give the players something they could focus on in terms of how the corruption of the mythos is exemplified through their character in the game at that point. So that's why things like we brought in the bouts of madness, which give a very defined period, a defined type of action that a character can undergo when their Cthulhu mythos experience is pretty bad. So things like that. But yeah, that's a couple of examples. There's plenty of others, I guess.
I have one question which might be a bit like throwing rocks at your favorite child, but is there a part of the Call of Cthulhu rules in 7th edition that you moved through because of legacy or because of a decision that you made at the time when you were doing the conversion, which now in the light of day, you wish you'd done somewhat differently?
Yeah. I think I think we literally tore out my hair, and Paul some of his hair, trying to work on the automatic fire rules. We had many different versions of those rules, and each getting more complicated as we went. And we kept trying to, no, that's too complicated. And so the one we have now works fine. You have to, like most things, you have to read it and you have to try it out a few times before it becomes second nature. Just like if you've never made a skill roll before, you have to understand what you're doing, and then you have to do it a few times, and then it becomes second nature. You don't even have to think about it. But because automatic fire is not a common thing in most Call of Cthulhu games, it tends to stand out because people do not get that experience of doing it a few times to get it into their nature. But having said all of that, the rule works. It's still a bit too complicated for my liking. It's still a little bit too many things to think about at the table. I'd like to simplify that a little bit more, make it a little bit more streamlined. And both Paul and I continue to talk about things like this and think about, well, down the road, should there ever be, I'm sure, at some point, I know we're not doing an 8th edition tomorrow or anything, or the next year, but somewhere down the far road when, we do a 7.5 or an 8th edition in 20 years time, who knows, don't hold me to any dates, then, we would relook at that. And we may look at ways of trying to introduce some optional rule variants for those things like automatic fire. Before then, we may look to do some sort of here's a free PDF of some ideas we've got about how you might want to rework automatic fire, which are just optional. You can try them out, and see where it goes. But yeah, that would do. We love chases. We think they work really well. I think the chapter is just a bit too wordy, and again, we could be more concise and try and find a way to better present the information in a slightly more user-friendly way. I think the rules themselves work fine, but again, it's often the case with rules, I could say often the case with any writing of anything whatsoever, it's never finished, as I'm sure many people before me have said. Something is never finished. You have to just go, right, it's done today, and then we release it. But, the following day, it's like, wow, we could change this, or we could do that. And that's what, the same with the 7th edition rules. There's constantly things that we want to kind of refine and improve upon, where, based on what is now years of play testing in the real world. So that's something to, I would want to, relook at.
I have one last question for you on that topic. Stepping away though from Call of Cthulhu for a minute, do you have any other tabletop role-playing game rule systems which, from a mechanical perspective, you think are really impressive? Obviously, there's so many games that have great worlds, but are there any mechanical systems that have influenced you particularly?
I mean, it's always been a lot. The heart has always been, something from the Chaosium family, the BRP 100 system, but games that I've liked the mechanics of. I really love a really old game that's, I don't know how you can get it now or not. It came from the late show, which is a very small kind of, I guess, pre-indie game that is about kind of 1950s schlock horror kind of exploitation monster movies kind of thing. And the mechanic that I just thought was a fantastic idea was that each of your characters is kind of an actor in the the film that you are living in real life in the game. And so because you're a 1950s actor, you have stunt doubles. So if you're about to get eaten by the monster, you can call in your stunt double to kind of take the hit, and maybe they survive, but maybe they don't. And you have a limited number of stunt doubles, obviously, before you run out. I just thought it was a really cool idea. So I really like that mechanic, the idea. It's a little bit, I guess, similar to a Paranoia with the clones. It's a similar kind of mechanic to that, I guess. So that's so Paranoia and clones, it would be the same answer, I guess. I like those, and I'm trying to think of something else that's really impressed me. There's a lot of new games I've tried, and I think they're okay, but I wouldn't say they've impressed me in the same way. I think being really old school, I really liked it when D&D introduced skills, because for many years I just wanted to know how do I sneak in D&D if I'm not a thief? Because surely they aren't the only people that can do that in the world. And so, you know, when they introduced skills, I thought that was a great innovation in terms of the game. Yeah, I like. I'm not a. I like Monster Hearts. I think that's probably for me one of the best interpretations of the Powered by the Apocalypse engine. I've had difficulty with some of the other kind of iterations of that. I've not really got into it. I can't. I find there's too much that gets in the way of the role playing for me sometimes. But Monster Hearts does it very well, and so I have no issues about it. I like that. So there's lots of things like that, you know, the original. I'm so easily slipping into background and world building in my head, because I'm thinking like the other game I really love is Slay Industries, and you know, although there's a new edition just been released with, you know, updated rules and is all wonderful. The original, obviously, but the reason I love it is not really the rules; it's the setting, and it's so easy to slip into the whole thing. It's like, you know, you know, you trouble is you look at some of the older games in your experience through your experiences, and you can't help but wear rose-tinted spectacles. I often find myself having to take off the rose-tinted spectacles and look at things with a clinical eye and a more modern eye, and go like, yeah, it was fine at the time, but it isn't fine now, kind of approach. So I'm often kind of throwing my rose-tinted spectacles away. But Slay Industries, it's hard to. I think they're kind of ingrained into my eyes, the rose-tinted spectacles for Slay Industries. So that's why I still kind of love the game. But there you go.